Salt in her water ration for punishment on the trail. A Lakota chief poured her fresh from his skin. The gourd was in my hand before I knew I'd crossed the fire. I didn't think about it. That's the thing I want you to understand from the start. A man who thinks too long before he acts that way is a man weighing something, calculating a cost, deciding what it earns him. I didn't weigh anything. I was sitting on the far side of the fire eating dried meat, and I heard the sound, not a cry. Nothing as clean as that, just a small broken intake of breath. The kind a person makes when they've run out of ways to react to pain, and the body is doing the reacting on its own. And I was already standing. The gourd was in my hand, my own water. Carried it since the Powder River 2 days back, rationed it the way you do in dry July, a careful man's 3 swallows in the morning and 3 at night. I crossed the fire and I crouched down in front of her, and I held it out, and she flinched back hard enough to hit the wheel of the trade wagon behind her, and I understood then what she'd been living with. Her name was Clara Marsh. I didn't know it yet. I knew only what I could see. A white woman, maybe 30, maybe less, hard to say after what had been done to her, with a length of braided rawhide tied from her left wrist to an iron pin driven into the wagon bed. Her lips were cracked the way lips crack after a day without water in July heat, that particular splitting at the corner of the mouth that I have seen on dying horses. Her hair was the color of river mud when it dries and the sun has been at it. Her eyes, when she finally stopped flinching long enough to look at me, were a gray-green, and they were doing the only thing left to them, measuring threat. I held the gourd steady and waited. It is important, with a frightened animal or a frightened person, that you do not move while they decide. You hold what you are holding and you breathe, and you do not shift your weight or clear your throat, or do any of the 100 small things an impatient man does to fill silence. Silence is the offer. It gives them time to understand that the offer is real. She took the gourd. She drank 3 swallows and then stopped herself and held it back toward me, and I said, in English, which I had spoken since I was 7 years old, and a Presbyterian missionary named Aldous Webb had decided my soul was worth saving, I said, "There's enough." She drank the rest. I stood up. Walks Far was watching me from across the fire. He had the kind of face that never gave you anything unless he wanted you to have it, and right now it was giving me nothing. He was the one who had salted her water ration 2 days back when she had refused to carry a bundle he'd put to her. I had not seen him do it. I had heard about it later, the way you hear about things in a traveling column, sideways in pieces, the way men talk when they want to tell you something without telling you directly. A word here, a pause there, the shape of what went unsaid. I stood up and I looked at Walks Far across the fire, and I said to him in Lakota, "She rides with me from here." He said nothing. I said, "I'm not asking. This is where I need to tell you something about who I was, so that what came next makes sense. My name, my Lakota name, the one that mattered on the northern plains in 1873, was Sunkasapa, Black Dog. I had been given that name at 14 for reasons I won't go into here except to say they involved a winter, a hunting party, 2 dead men, and a wolf I had not killed but had made an arrangement with in the dark. My father had been Broken Shield, a war chief of the Oglala Band, and he had died at the Laramie Treaty talks in a way that was not an accident, and the men who had been with him, the survivors, had come home and made me what my father had been before me. I was not old, 36 years, but I had been a chief for 11 of them, and in 11 years you learn what kind of silence falls when you speak. That silence fell now. Walks Far looked at me a long time. He was Cheyenne, a trader the column had picked up at a crossing 3 days back, and he had no standing here except what his goods gave him, which was enough for some of the younger men to treat him like a man worth listening to. He had 2 horses and a wagon of goods, and a woman he'd taken from a Crow raiding party with a bad hand of cards, which was not the same as having earned anything. He understood the difference between that and what I was. He looked away. I went back to the fire and I sat down and I ate the rest of my dried meat. And after a while one of my men, a young warrior named Red Hale who thought everything was a story worth telling later, came and sat beside me and said very quietly in Lakota, "You're going to cut her loose." "Yes," I said. "Her man is dead, the whole party." "I know. So you're taking her." I looked at him. "I'm making sure she doesn't die of thirst 3 days from the nearest settlement because a Cheyenne card player thinks salt and rope are a way to handle a woman. Yes. That's what I'm doing." Red Hale was quiet. Then he said, "She's not going to understand that." "No," I said, "she won't." That was honest. It might have been the most honest thing I said the whole first week. I cut her loose at first light. Not with ceremony, not with explanation. I walked to the wagon in the gray before sunrise and I crouched down and I opened the knot in the rawhide. It was a good knot, tied by someone who knew rope, and I set her wrist free, and then I stood and waited again while she did the same thing she'd done with the water gourd. Flinched, measured, decided I was a threat, decided I was less of a threat than whatever came next, and accepted. I handed her a piece of dried meat. It was all I had on me at that hour. She took it the same way she'd taken the water, the way a starved animal takes food from an unknown hand, not trusting it but needing it more than the trust mattered. I pointed to the horse I'd cut from the string the night before, a steady gray mare named for the sound she made when she was cold, which in Lakota amounts to something like complainer, though I never told Clara that. I pointed to the horse. I pointed to myself. I moved in the direction we were traveling. She understood. She did not thank me. I did not expect thanks. A thank you at that point would have been a social performance, something she'd have been doing for me rather than for herself, and I did not want anything from her that was for me. I wanted her on the horse and alive, and not dying slowly behind a trade wagon tied to an iron pin. That was the whole of it, at that moment. There was a moment mid-morning, when Walks Far rode up alongside me. He came from behind on my left, which is not the side a man approaches from if he means nothing by it, and he matched my pace and rode without speaking for 100 yards or so, which is what a man does when he wants you to know he has something to say and is deciding how to say it. I waited. "That woman," he said finally in Lakota, "has a value. I gave 2 good horses for her. The crow did not give her away." I kept my eyes on the trail ahead. "You gave 2 horses to a man in a card game," I said. "That's not the same as a value I recognize." He said, "She is mine." I let a moment pass, just long enough for him to feel the quality of what was coming. "She was tied to your wagon with a rawhide cord," I said, "and her water was salt." I paused. "If you want to make a problem about this, you're welcome to make it, but I want you to look at the column behind me before you decide." He looked. 22 men. Men who had been with me through hard country for 4 years. Men who knew what I asked of them and knew what I gave back. Not a threatening look in any of them. They were riding, watching the trail, doing what they always did, which was exactly the point. They were not performing threat. They were simply, plainly, what they were. "I will take payment," Walks Far said. "No," I said, "you won't." He rode with that for a moment. Then he said, with the tone of a man trying to find the angle that works, "She'll slow you down. She doesn't know this country. She'll eat your provisions and ride your mare and be trouble to you by the first cold night." "That's my concern," I said. "I'm trying to spare you." "Walks Far." I said his name quietly, the way you say a word when you want it to end a conversation. "Go back to your wagon." He went. Red Hale, who had been riding just far enough behind to hear all of this, moved up alongside me. He had the look of a man composing something he intended to tell later at considerable length. "Not a word," I said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You were composing," I said. "A man can think." "Think quietly," I said. We rode all that day with her perhaps 15 feet behind me and to my left, which is where I gestured when she'd hesitated about where to ride, close enough that she was under my eye and the rest of the column knew it, far enough that she wasn't pressed into a conversation she had no words for. The column was 23 men, a mix of Oglala and 2 Brule families, and a handful of mixed-blood traders who ran between the settlements and the camps and belonged fully to neither, which is a condition I understood in a way I had no particular interest in discussing. We were moving northeast, toward the Black Hills country, following a route I had ridden 11 times. By midday the heat was the kind that makes the air above the grass ripple like water, and she was riding with her head down, and one hand pressed flat against the back of her neck, which I recognized as a woman trying to keep the sun off the base of her skull, where there was no hat to help her. I dropped back alongside her and took off my own hat and held it out, which required a whole separate negotiation of the flinch and measure variety. She stared at it, stared at me, looked away, looked back, and then she put it on, and it was too large and sat low over her eyes, and she looked, I have to say, approximately ridiculous, and something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, not that far yet, but something that was remembering what a smile was, the shape of the thing, the memory of the muscle. I turned back to the front of the column and rode on. That night I set my camp 20 feet from where she bedded down in the grass, and I sat up until the camp had quieted, until every fire had gone low and every man was down, and the horses had stopped their nighttime restlessness, and only then did I sleep. I did not do this because I had decided to do it. I did it because I did it. Sometimes you don't know why you do a thing until much later, and sometimes not even then. Her name came to me on the 3rd day. I woke before first light, as I always did, and built the fire small and boiled water for the dense black coffee I had traded 3 good arrows for at a settlement 3 weeks prior, and she was already awake, sitting on her bedroll with her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped around them, watching the fire the way people watch fire when what they're really doing is being somewhere else entirely. I'd given her a bedroll from a pile of trade goods. Walks Far had not objected to this, which told me he'd fully understood where the boundary was now, and a wool blanket that smelled like horse and cedar, and a canteen that was hers and would stay hers. I poured coffee into a tin cup and held it out. She said, "Thank you." It was the first thing she'd said to me, first words in 3 days. Her voice was low and had a rasp in it that I thought was partly the cracked lips and partly something deeper, the kind of rasp that comes from screaming a long time back and not all the way healing. I nodded. I poured my own cup. We sat on opposite sides of the small fire and drank coffee while the sky went from black to purple to a thin, hard line of orange at the edge of the world, and after a while she said, "Clara Marsh, my name." "Sunkasapa," I said, "mine." She turned it in her mouth without saying it, testing the sounds. Then she said, "You spoke English to me before." "Yes." "Where did you learn?" "A missionary. I was 7. She looked at me for a moment. I had a face that people reacted to. I'd had it since I was 14, since the wolf and the winter and the 2 dead men, and what it had given me was a scar that ran from the left corner of my jaw up through my cheekbone to the outer edge of my eye socket, and pulled the skin in a way that made my face, in certain lights, look like something had tried to take it apart. White settlers tended to stare. She looked at the scar directly, which was different, not the sliding look away that most people did, but a straight reckoning, the way you look at something you've decided to understand rather than avoid. "What was his name, the missionary?" "Aldous Webb." "Was he good to you?" I thought about that with real honesty, the way the question deserved. "He taught me English and Latin and how to read from the Bible. He was frightened of me by the time I was 12. He meant well." "Most people who are frightened of you do," she said. And then she looked at the fire like she'd surprised herself, like those words had come out before she'd checked them, and she went quiet again. I drank my coffee. She drank hers. The sun came over the horizon and hit the grass, and the dew on the grass turned briefly to something that looked like a million small fires, and then it dried and was just grass again, and the day started in earnest. What I want to tell you, and what is hard to tell without it sounding like I'm building towards something I already knew the outcome of, is that it was not like that. I did not know the outcome of anything. I was a man who had been alone a long time. Not alone without people. I had my band, my men, the families who traveled with us, the whole intricate web of obligation and kinship and responsibility that being a chief means, but alone in the way that a man who has not been chosen by a woman for a long time is alone. My wife had died 4 years back. Her name was Morning Salt, which is a Lakota way of saying the light on water just after sunrise, and she had died of the fever that came through the camps in the winter of '69, and I had buried her in the high ground above the Powder River, and I had not buried my grief with her, which is not something you can do anyway no matter what people tell you about time. I was not looking for a woman. I was not looking for anything. I was moving my people northeast, and I had found a woman dying of thirst and rage behind a trade wagon, and I had done what seemed necessary. That was all. Except that's not entirely true, and if I am going to tell this story, I am going to tell it right. There was something in Clara Marsh that I recognized. I don't know a cleaner way to say it than that. Not her face, not the way she looked. It was not about any of that, not yet. It was the way she held herself after the thing that had broken her, not collapsed inward, not shattered into dependence. Cracked, yes. Hurt badly, yes. But still there. Still making herself upright every morning and getting on the horse and riding the day out and making her face do what needed doing. That is a particular kind of toughness that has nothing to do with not being hurt and everything to do with what you choose to do while you are. I had been watching it for 3 days from 15 feet back and to my left, and I recognized it because it was the only kind of toughness I had any respect for. So when I say I was not looking for anything, I mean it, but I also mean that a man can recognize a thing without looking for it. Those two facts can live in the same chest at the same time. She started talking on the 4th day. It came out in the way things that have been held too long come out, not all at once, not in the right order, not in any order that would make sense if you were trying to write it in a ledger. She talked while we rode. She talked at the fire in the evening. She talked in pieces and fragments, and sometimes she would stop mid-sentence, and the sentence would just end there, unfinished, and I would let it end, because some sentences aren't meant to finish. Her husband's name had been Thomas Marsh. They had come out from Ohio the year before, which made them one of the later waves, the ones who came thinking the first waves had done the hard work. Thomas had been a decent man, she said. She said it plainly, without making it into more than it was, a decent man, not a great one, not a visionary, just a man who worked hard and treated her right and wanted land. They had been on the trail to a settlement near the Niobrara when the Crow raiding party had hit the wagon train. 4 wagons, 7 men. 2 women and a child. She did not tell me what she had seen, and I did not ask her, and that silence between us was a kind of agreement, a mutual decision that some things did not need to be narrated to be understood. She'd been taken by the Crow, traded twice, once for horses, once for something she described only as goods, and kept her eyes on the fire when she said it. Then sold to walks far in that card game, if sold was the right word for it, and put to work on the trail. On the 5th morning we came to a shallow creek crossing, and the water was warm and low, and she stopped the gray mare and looked at the creek for a long moment, and then she looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read, not fear, not the measuring threat look. Something older than that, a wanting. I looked at the column ahead, already crossing, and then back at her. "We have 10 minutes, I said. I turned my horse to face away from the creek, and I sat and watched the empty country to the east while she did whatever she needed to do in the water. I heard her in it, the particular sound of a person washing, the small sounds of cold water and cupped hands. I heard her exhale once, a long releasing sound, like something coming loose. I kept my eyes on the eastern horizon. When she came back to her horse and remounted and came up alongside me, I did not say anything, and neither did she. We crossed the creek and caught up to the column's rear. That evening she told me all of it, the parts she'd left out before. She told it in a flat, even voice with her eyes on the fire, and I listened to all of it without comment, without the various sounds people make to signal that they are listening and finding things horrible, because she was not telling it to get those sounds from me. She was telling it to get it outside of herself, to put it somewhere that was not inside her chest anymore, and the only thing she needed from me was to receive it without flinching. I received it without flinching. When she was finished, she said, "You didn't look away." "No," I said. "People do," she said. "When they hear something like that, they look somewhere else. I think they're trying to give you privacy, but what it feels like is they can't stand to be in the same space as the thing that happened." "I know," I said. She was quiet for a while, then, "Thank you." I nodded. We both watched the fire do its slow work on the wood, and the night settled in around us. And after a while she slept, and I stayed up another hour feeding the fire in small pieces and thinking about a man named Walks Far who was 3 days behind us, and whom I had, in a sense, already dealt with by the simple act of still being who I was. On the 5th day, I told her about Killdeer Station. "There is a settlement," I said, 3 days northeast. "There are white people there, a trading post and a homesteader community. I will take you there." She was quiet. We were riding side by then. Somewhere in the 3rd day, she'd moved up from 15 feet behind me to alongside without either of us marking it as a thing that had happened. "And then," she said, "and then you're with your own people." She thought about that a long time. A hawk was doing something in the sky to our north, working a thermal, and we both watched it without saying so. "I don't have people," she said. "Thomas was my people." I had nothing useful to say to that, so I said nothing. "What do they know about?" She stopped, started again. "What will they think, the settlement people, when I come in with you?" And there it was, the thing she hadn't been able to ask for 5 days. Not the practical question, not whether I'd protect her on the trail or feed her or keep her alive. Those I'd answered already in the language of actions, which is the only language that means anything anyway. What she was asking now was the harder thing. What story would they tell about her, and would I care about the answer? "I'll tell them I found you on the trail," I said, "that you survived an attack and I brought you in." "That's true," she said. "Yes," I said, "it is." She looked at me. The hat I'd lent her was still on her head. She'd given it back twice and I'd waved it off twice, and it was sitting better now that she'd bent the brim back to manage the fit. The gray-green eyes. "Why?" she said. I knew what she was asking. She wasn't asking why I'd take her to the settlement. She was asking why any of it, the water, the horse, the cut rawhide, the coffee, the riding alongside, all of it. Why had I done it? I thought about what was true, I said, because no one was going to. That was true. It was also not all of it, but it was what I had words for at that point, and Clara Marsh was a woman who understood the difference between what a man could say and what he meant, and she did not push. She turned back to watch the trail. The night before we reached Killdeer Station, we camped in a dry creek bed where there were cottonwoods big enough to block the wind, which had been coming hard from the northwest all day, with the kind of edge in it that means the season is thinking about changing. The rest of the column had made their own fires and given us the space that they had been giving us for several days now, a respectful distance that came from the understanding that something was going on between the chief and the white woman that was none of their business. Red Hale had given me one look that managed to contain an entire editorial, and I had returned it with the face that meant the editorial was not welcome. Clara helped me build the fire. She did it without being asked, gathered the wood, arranged it right, waited while I got the spark going. We'd been doing this for 5 nights now, the same ritual division of the small tasks, and she'd taken over the wood gathering without comment somewhere around day 3. We ate dried meat and a handful of dried berries I'd traded for at the last band we'd passed, and the last of the coffee, which I made strong because it was the last of it, and there was no point in being thrifty about it now. After a while she said, "I'm not afraid of you." I looked up. "I was," she said. "The first day, maybe 2 days, I was afraid of everything, so it wasn't particular, but I want you to know I'm not now." "All right," I said. "I thought you should know." "I appreciate it," I said. She poked at the fire with a stick. A silence went by. The cottonwood leaves were doing their particular dry rattle in the wind, a sound like old paper, and an owl somewhere behind us was making its presence known to whatever was moving in the grass. "What happens to you," she said. "After Kildare Station, you just go back." "North," I said, "the Powder River country before snow." "You have family there." "My band, men, families I'm responsible for." She nodded like she understood responsibility, which she probably did in her own way. "Will you come back this way?" she said, and then immediately before I could answer, "I mean, do you pass through? Does your route pass through Kildare Station country?" "Sometimes," I said. She nodded again, poked the fire again. The ember at the end of her stick fell off into the ash. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I don't know how to say it right." "Try," I said. She looked at me across the fire. The light was doing what firelight does to a person's face, pulling the depth out of it, finding the planes and hollows, making the eyes go dark and deep. "I know what I looked like when you found me," she said. "I know what I was. I'd stopped, I don't know the word for it, I'd stopped pushing against it. I was doing what I was told because the other thing hurt too much and I didn't see a way through, and I think maybe I was letting go of the idea that there was a way through." She paused. "And then you crossed the fire with the water, and I want you to know what that did. Not the water, just the fact of it. A man deciding that what was happening to me was not right and was going to stop." The owl called again. The wind moved the cottonwoods. "You didn't do it because I asked," she said. "I hadn't asked, I'd given up asking. You looked across the fire and you decided." I sat with that. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am going to be all right because of that. Not only because of the water and the horse and bringing me to the settlement, because of the deciding, because someone saw it and decided." I did not say anything for a moment. There are things a man can hear that sit in his chest differently from other things. They don't make a sound when they land. They just change the weight of the air inside you, and you know something has changed, and you don't necessarily have a word for what. "You would have come through," I said, "with or without the water." "Maybe," she said. "But I don't think so." She said it plainly, without drama, the way a person states a thing they've thought about carefully. I think I needed someone to decide. We came into Kildare Station the next morning around 9 o'clock when the sun was still low enough to be behind us, and the shadow of the column stretched long across the pale grass. The station was what those places always were. A low log trading post with a sod roof, 2 homestead shanties nearby, a corral with 6 horses and a mule, a well, and the usual assortment of people who'd come out a long way from everything familiar and were making the best of having done so. They came out when they saw us, about 8 adults and 3 children. I could see the calculation in their faces. A Lakota column with a white woman. How do you read that? And I watched their hands, and I watched where their eyes went to find the nearest rifle. I knew this calculation. I'd seen it 10,000 times. It was one of the ongoing costs of being who I was in this time in this country, and I had long ago made my peace with it by deciding that I would do what was right regardless of what was assumed about me, and the results would speak. I stopped 20 yards out. Red Hale and the others stopped behind me. I said in English, loud enough to carry, "This woman's name is Clara Marsh. She survived a crow raiding party on the Niobrara Trail 11 days ago. Her husband was Thomas Marsh out of Ohio. I found her on the trail and I brought her here. I paused. She's had a hard time of it. She could use food and water and a door to sleep behind. A pause while they absorbed this. A woman in the group, heavyset, gray hair tied back, wearing an apron that had been patched many times, stepped forward. She looked at Clara, then at me. "She hurt," the woman said. "She's well," I said. "She's strong, she needs rest." The gray-haired woman looked at me a moment more. The same straight reckoning look Clara had given me that first morning. A woman deciding whether the thing in front of her was what it presented itself as. And then she seemed to make a decision. And she walked past me to Clara's horse and held up her hand. Clara looked at me. I nodded once. She dismounted and went with the woman. At the doorway of the trading post she stopped and turned back. She was 40 feet away and the sun was in my eyes, but I could see her face clearly enough. She looked at me the way I had not been looked at in a long time, not with gratitude, which would have embarrassed us both, not with pity, which I would have refused, just a clear, direct, reckoning look. The kind that says, "I see you. I know what you are. I know what you chose to do and why." She held it a moment. Then she went inside. I turned the column north. I did not tell myself anything about it on the first mile. I rode and kept my eyes on the country and did not allow myself to circle back to the door of the trading post, to that look, to the particular way she had held it before going in. That was a door I'd closed, and I did not need to stand outside it and wonder what was on the other side. By the 3rd mile, I was doing exactly that. By the 6th, I had nearly talked myself into the position that it was a clean ending. She was safe. She was fed. She was behind a door. I'd done what needed doing when I heard hoofbeats behind me. Single horse moving fast. I held up a hand and the column stopped and I turned. It was Clara, on the gray mare, my mare, the one I'd put her on 11 days ago, still wearing my hat. Riding hard, leaning into it, the mare's hooves throwing dry clods behind her, and the look on Clara's face was a particular look I want to try to describe accurately, because I've carried it with me a long time. It was not panicked. It was not the loose, desperate look of a person fleeing something. It was the opposite, focused, decided, like a woman who has thought hard about a thing and reached the end of the thinking, and is now on the far side of the deliberation in the clean country of the done decision. She pulled the mare up 6 feet from me. The mare blew hard and tossed her head, and I reached over automatically and steadied her with a hand at the neck. Clara was breathing fast. 6 miles at a gallop will do that. She said, "I don't have people at Kildare Station." I waited. "I don't have people anywhere," she said. "Thomas was my people and he's gone, and there is nothing in Ohio that is mine anymore, and there is nothing at that trading post that is mine." She paused, one breath. "But I know what you are. I've watched you for 11 days. I know how you treat your people, and I know how you make your decisions, and I know what you think a man owes the people in his care." Another breath. "And I'm asking you, I'm not running from something, I'm asking, I want to come with you." Somewhere behind me, Red Hale said something very quietly in Lakota to the man beside him, and I did not look back, but I was reasonably certain it translated as something along the lines of "called it." I looked at Clara Marsh on that gray mare in the September light, which was thinner now than it had been in July, the sun lower and the shadows longer, and the whole world showing the first signs of getting ready for the hard time coming. She was sitting straight. The gray-green eyes were steady. She had made a decision, and she was telling me about it, and she was not flinching. "You understand what you're asking?" I said. "Yes. It's not easy country, and I am not an easy life." "I know that," she said. "I've been watching." "And you're not," I stopped, tried it different. "You're not doing this because you're frightened of what's behind you. I need that to be true." "It's true," she said. "I'm doing it because I know what's in front of me." She held my eyes. "You. The people you're responsible for, a life that is real, that means something." She paused. I've been thinking since last night, since you said you'd come back this way sometimes. I thought about that all night, what sometimes meant, and by morning I understood I couldn't do it. Wait for sometimes. I looked at her a long moment. Then I looked back at the column, at Red Hale, who was working very hard to appear to be examining something on the horizon, at the other men who were doing various elaborate versions of the same thing, and I made a sound that had not come out of me in a long time, a short, low sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same neighborhood. I moved the column forward. Clara fell in alongside me. The same place she'd been on the fourth day, not 15 feet back, not in formation, just alongside, where the writing was. We rode north. I'm going to tell you about the first time she saw me work. Not work in the sense of camp labor, she'd seen that, the fire building and the horse tending and the dozen small tasks a traveling column generates every hour. I mean the other kind of work. The kind a man does that has nothing decorative about it. The kind where everything either goes right or people go hungry. It was 3 weeks north of Killdeer Station, early October, the grass starting to cure and go pale gold. We were in buffalo country, the edges of it, the approach, where you start to see sign before you see animals. The wallows pressed into the earth, the stripped bark on trees where they'd rubbed, the smell on the wind that you either know or you don't. I had sent 3 men ahead the evening before, and they'd come back with word that there was a small herd, maybe 60 animals, moving slow on a plateau to the northwest, heading toward a creek drainage for the evening water. I gave the camp its orders in the gray before sunrise, moving quietly, everyone knowing their part. 2 families stayed with the horses and the supplies. The rest of us moved out. Clara came. I had not told her to stay. I had not told her to come either. She'd watched me give the orders, and when the group moved out she was with it, on the gray mare, sitting her horse the way she'd learned to sit it, loose and ready, not the stiff posting trot of an Eastern rider but the settled economy of someone who'd been in the saddle for weeks now. I saw her and I said nothing. She met my eye and I nodded once, which meant, stay back, stay out of the way, watch. The hunt went the way a good hunt goes, quickly, quietly, the animals not knowing what was happening until it was done. I will not narrate the details because that is not the story. The story is what happened after. We had 2 animals down. Good clean kills, both of them, and the work of butchering is hard work, the kind that takes time and strong hands and knowledge of where the cuts are, and everyone in the group knew their part. I was working on the second animal up to my elbows in it, when I became aware that Clara had dismounted and come up beside one of the older women and was watching carefully, the way she always watched, not squeamish, not performing toughness, just learning the cuts. Within 20 minutes she was working alongside the woman, doing what she was shown. I noticed this. I kept my eyes on what I was doing and I noticed it. Later, after we'd loaded the pack horses and were heading back to camp, she came alongside me. Her hands were still dark from the work, and there was a smear of something on her cheekbone. She did not seem aware of it. "We'll eat tonight," I said. "We'll eat for a week," she said. The knowledge was already in her voice. She'd already calculated the yield the way a practical woman calculates, thinking ahead to portions and preservation and what the cold would do. Stan's watching showed me how they handle the back fat, for the cold months. I looked at her. "She's teaching me a lot," Clara said. "She doesn't explain. She just shows you the right way, and if you do it wrong she shows you again. I like that." "She's been teaching that way for 30 years, I said. "It works," she said simply. And then she was quiet, looking at the trail ahead, and I was quiet too, and we rode back to camp with the weight of the kill on the pack horses and the afternoon sun getting long and the first real cold in the air, the kind that says summer is finished with its argument, and I thought, this is a woman who sees what needs doing and does it. This is a woman who learns without needing praise for the learning. I thought, I know this kind of person. I thought, I have been alone a long time. I'm going to tell you about that first winter, because it was the winter that made everything else. The Powder River country in December is not a place that asks what you think of it. It presents itself, and what it presents is this. You are small, the cold is large, and the distance between you and dead is a matter of preparation, attention, and luck in roughly equal measure. I had been wintering in that country for 20 years, and I still respected it the way you respect something that does not care about you personally. Clara Marsh had never seen a plains winter in her life. She did not pretend otherwise. That is something I want to say plainly because it would have been easier in some ways if she tried to perform capabilities she didn't have. Some people do that. They arrive in a new and difficult circumstance and they fake the knowledge because they're afraid that not having it makes them less. Clara didn't do that. She watched. She asked. She asked me things and she asked the women of the camp, particularly a woman named Stands Watching, who was the wife of my second man and who had sized Clara up in the first week with the thoroughness of a magistrate and apparently found her acceptable, because she began teaching her without being asked and without ceremony, and she listened to what she was told and then she did it. She got things wrong. She corrected them. She did not make a performance of either the wrongness or the correction. The first thing she learned was fire. In a plains winter, fire is not a comfort. It is a decision you are making over and over to keep living, and it requires attention the way water requires a vessel, constantly. She learned the right wood, the right arrangement, the right way to bank it for the night so it would still be there in the gray frozen morning. She learned this in about 4 days, which told me something about her mind. The second thing she learned was that cold on the plains is not like cold in Ohio. It is not a thing you put a coat on against. It is a thing you negotiate a relationship with. You learn its patterns. You understand what the sky is telling you in the hour before it turns bad. You read the air on your face and know from the feel of it which kind of night you are about to have. She learned this more slowly because it was a subtler thing, but she learned it. By November, she was reading the sky the way the camp women did, with the same unhurried assessment, the same private calculation. She slept in a tipi adjacent to mine. That was the arrangement, the one that kept her protected within the camp's social structure without asking anything of either of us that we hadn't decided to give. I had explained this to her in plain terms on the second day of travel north, and she'd received it the same way she received most things I told her, with a listening stillness and then a nod that meant she'd understood and accepted. What I had not said, and what I think we both understood anyway, was that the arrangement was a starting place, not an ending place. That there was something between us that was becoming something, and we were both watching it become without rushing it, the way you watch a fire that is doing exactly what you want it to do. You don't poke at it, you just tend it and let it breathe. There was a thing that happened in November that I am going to tell you because it is the kind of thing you don't forget. I had been out with 5 men for 4 days to the east, following up on reports of a raiding party that had been hitting the smaller settlements along the creek drainages. We found what we found and handled it the way it needed to be handled, and came back in the cold gray afternoon of the 4th day with the horses tired and all of us ready to be still. I came into camp and something was different. I could feel it before I could see it, a change in the way the camp was organized, something attended to that I hadn't left attended. I went to where I had left my firewood stacked and found it restacked, larger, with a second pile alongside it, new cut, the chips still white. I went to my tipi and found the smoke hole adjusted for the wind direction, which had shifted in the 4 days I was gone. Inside, my bedding had been shaken out and aired and refolded, and there was a clay pot near the coals that had something in it that was not yet cold. I found Stands Watching and asked her what had happened. She gave me the look she reserved for questions with obvious answers. She saw what needed doing, Stands Watching said. She did it. I stood there with that for a moment. The fire has been kept, I said. Every night. She kept yours and her own both. A pause. She asked me to teach her the smoke hole adjustment. I showed her twice. She didn't need to be shown again. I went to Clara's tipi and knocked at the flap. She came out, looked at me, looked at the stack of wood, looked back at me. "You were gone 4 days," she said. "It seemed," she paused, choosing words, "I know you would have done the same." I looked at her. The wind had her hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand and kept her eyes on mine. "I didn't do it to make a case," she said. "I did it because it needed doing." "I know," I said. "Good," she said, and went back inside. I stood there in the November wind and felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was the specific ease of being in the company of someone who simply did, who looked at what needed doing and did it, without requirement for thanks or acknowledgement or validation. Morning Salt had been like that. I had forgotten, in 4 years, how much weight that quality could take off a man, how much of the constant vigilance and effort of living it could ease, simply by doubling the number of people watching for what needed doing. I went back to my fire. It was burning exactly right. There was a night in February. Not a special night in any way the calendar would note. Just a February night, which means the cold was the kind that makes the air itself crack. A cold you can hear, the trees in the creek bed popping like rifle shots every hour. I'd been out with 2 men checking on the horses. We'd had trouble with a line coming loose in the wind, and one of the younger horses had got itself half tangled. And I'd been out in it for 2 hours by the time I came back, and the cold by then was inside me the way cold gets when you've been out long enough. Not just at the surface of the skin, but deep in the chest, in the bones, that particular chill that takes a long time to leave. I went to my tipi, and I built the fire back up from coals, and I was crouching over it working the warmth back into my hands when the door flap opened. "Clara." She had her blanket around her shoulders and her hair was down. I had not seen it down before. It was longer than I'd known, past her shoulders, and she had that look on her face, the decided look, the look that meant she had thought about something until she reached the far side of it. She came and crouched down on the other side of the fire. She put her hands out toward the heat. "I heard you come back," she said. "I heard you out there for 2 hours. I could hear you in the cold." "The horse line," I said. "I know." She looked at her hands over the fire. "I want to say something, and I am going to say it directly because I have found that's the only way that works between us." "All right," I said. "I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I know that's what people would say if they knew. White woman alone, Lakota camp, she had no choice. I want you to know that's not true. I had choices. Killdeer Station was a choice. I could have gone back to Ohio. There were choices. I made this one." She looked up at me across the fire. "I made it because of you specifically, because of who you are specifically, because of what I have seen in you from that first night to right now, and I want you to know that." The fire cracked, one of those long settling sounds that fire makes when a log shifts. I said, "Clara." "I'm not finished," she said, which was exactly the thing Morning Salt used to say to me in Lakota, with the same particular tone of a woman who has earned the right to complete a sentence, and it hit me somewhere between the sternum and the throat. "When I watched you with your men," she said, "when I watched you make a decision and the whole column understand it without you raising your voice, when I watched you check on the horses in February cold for 2 hours and come back and not say a word about it to anyone, when you told me what I needed to know and didn't tell me what I didn't need and let me figure out the rest myself, when you looked at me that morning at Killdeer Station, before you turned north, and you saw me, the way you saw me." She paused. "I have never been seen that way by anyone. Thomas was good to me. He was, but he saw what he expected to see. You saw what was there." She stood up. She was still holding the blanket around her shoulders, and she stepped around the fire, not to me, just closer around the fire, so there was nothing between us. No ring of stones, no flame, just the warmth of it from the side. "You are the best man I have ever known," she said. "I want you to know that I know that. I want you to know I chose this. I had been a chief for 11 years. I had made decisions in the dark and the cold and under fire, decisions that other men's lives depended on. I had buried my father and my wife and men I had been responsible for, and not looked away from any of it. I was not a man who had trouble knowing what to do. I stood up. I took one step and I put my hand against the side of her face. Carefully, the way you hold something that is real and you do not want to startle. And she put her hand over mine and held it there, her palm over my scarred knuckles. And she looked at me with those gray-green eyes that had stopped measuring threat a long time ago and were now simply, clearly seeing me. We stood like that a long time, with the fire working at the cold and the trees cracking outside in the deep February dark, and I understood that something had come to an end and something had begun, and I was not going to look away from either. Spring came the way it does in that country, not gently, not as a gradual softening, but as a series of arguments between the cold and the light, a week of warmth and then a hard freeze and then 3 days of rain and mud, and then one morning the meadowlarks coming back to the creek bottom and the whole world smelling like the inside of something that is waking up. We were alive. All of us. The whole camp had come through, which was not nothing. There had been a week in January that I will tell you about briefly, because it matters to what happened after. A family of 3 spotted elk, his wife 2 clouds, their daughter of maybe 6 years, had gone to gather wood from a stand of timber 2 miles from camp and had not come back by dark. In January, in that country, 2 hours after dark without shelter means you are working against something that does not negotiate. I took 4 men, and we went out in weather I would not have ridden into for any reason less than a life. The cold that night had teeth, not the dry cold of early winter that you can manage with good clothing and movement. This was the wet cold, the kind that gets through everything, that finds the gap at your collar and the seam in your moccasins and works in there, and begins the slow work of taking your warmth away from you piece by piece. I had been in cold like this before. I knew what it asked of you. It asked that you not stop, and that you not despair, and that you keep your mind working on the problem in front of you rather than on how cold you are. We found them 2.5 miles out, in a ravine they dropped into when the weather closed in good instinct. The ravine cut the wind, but Spotted Elk had broken his leg in the drop, and 2 clouds had built as much shelter as she could with what was there, and had the girl tucked against her body under both their coats, and she had been keeping them alive on wool alone for 3 hours when we arrived. We brought them back. It took until past midnight and the last mile I was walking and leading my horse because there was not room on the horse for the injured man and me both. And I will not tell you I was not cold because I was very cold, the kind of cold that makes your thinking slow and your hands stupid. But we brought them back and 2 Clouds' fire was still going and the little girl was crying, which was a good sound because it meant she was warm enough to cry. I went to my tippy and stripped off everything wet, and I was sitting by the coals rebuilding the fire when the flap opened. Clara. She came in without ceremony, sat down, and handed me a strip of dried meat and a cup of something hot, not coffee. The coffee was long gone by January, but a tea that stands watching made from dried plants that tasted like bark and winter air, and I had never been happier to hold something warm in my life. She did not say anything. She sat beside me while I ate and drank and let the fire rebuild, and after a while when the shaking in my hands had stopped she said quietly, "They're all right." "I know," I said. "I heard the girl." "Stan's watching is with 2 Clouds," she said. "The leg will heal. He said it himself, Spotted Elk, before you ask. He said it himself before we got him back. She helped him." I nodded. Clara sat with me until the fire was right and the tippy was warm and I had stopped being cold in the deep places where cold had gotten in. She did not make a performance of it. She did not make me feel looked after in a way that would have embarrassed either of us. She just stayed, in the quiet way she'd learned to stay, the way she'd learned everything, by watching what was needed and doing it without requirement for acknowledgement. When I was warm she went back to her tippy and I slept. That is what I mean when I say the winter made everything else. Clara was different in spring. Not a different person, the same person, which was the point, which was why she was different. She had come through the winter as herself. She had not been worn down to something smaller by the cold and the difficulty and the strangeness of everything. If anything, she was larger, clearer, more precisely herself than she had been in September, like the winter had burned off whatever was extraneous, and what was left was only the essential Clara Marsh. The woman who watched and decided and then acted without performance, who built a fire right, who could now converse in rough but entirely functional Lakota with Stan's watching, who had declared her acceptable sometime in November, and who had a higher standard for acceptable than almost anyone I knew. Red Hale came to me sometime in March and said, without preamble, which was his way, "The men have stopped watching her." I looked at him. "In the beginning," he said, "when she came with us, they watched her. Not like that, like you watch something uncertain, an animal you don't know the temperament of, a new horse." He paused. "They've stopped doing that." "What do they do now?" I said. She's there. She's part of the camp." Stan's watching argued with her last week about the right way to dry meat, and it was a real argument, both of them annoyed, and afterward they sat down and shared tea. "That's not how you treat a guest. That's how you treat—" He stopped. "Someone who belongs," I said. He nodded. I thought about this. It was a thing I had been seeing but had not said, because saying it would have made it a claim rather than simply a truth, and truths don't need to be claimed. They just are. "She came out in January," Red Hale said. "When you went for Spotted Elk's family, I was watching the camp while you were gone. She built your fire up before she went to sleep so it would be there when you came back." He paused. "She didn't know I was watching." I said nothing. "I just wanted you to know," he said, and walked away. That is the kind of thing Red Hale does. He notices things and he brings them to you, and then he walks away before you can respond, which means you carry the thing he's given you rather than processing it aloud and spending it on words. He's been doing it since he was 19 years old. It is one of his most useful and aggravating qualities. One morning in May, she came and stood beside me on the high ground above camp where I went sometimes in the early light, and she stood there the way she'd started standing, not leaning on me, not asking to be held, just beside me, the way two people stand when they are each their own person and they are also, plainly and without ceremony, together. The valley below us was doing what the Powder River Valley does in May, going green in a way that seems almost aggressive after the brown of winter, the grass coming up fast and bright, the cottonwoods putting out their leaves, the river running high and cold with snowmelt from the mountains to the west, which you could see on clear mornings as a long line of white against the sky. She said, "I want to stay." Not asking, not requesting consideration, stating. "I know," I said. "I know it means things," she said. "I know what people will say, white people, if I ever go back. I know I am choosing away from that. I'm choosing this." "You don't have to explain it to me," I said. She looked at me, a small pause. And then she said in Lakota, which she had been working at all winter with the same focused attention she brought to everything, "I know what you are. I know what you chose to do. I am staying because I want to, because there is nowhere else I want to be, and because you are the person I want to be near." Her Lakota was still rough, still a second language worn in her mouth like a new boot not yet broken in, but it was true. The words were true. I looked at her in the May morning, on the high ground above the valley, with the river below us and the mountains white on the horizon, and the whole long grass country stretching away in every direction under a sky that had exactly no limit. I took her hand. We stood there. There are things I could tell you about the years after, and there were years, good ones, the kind a man does not expect when he has been a long time alone and has made a certain peace with the idea that this is how it will end, but I won't try to tell all of it. Some of it I don't have the words for, and some of it is not mine alone to tell. What I will tell you is this. There was a morning the following autumn, late September, the cottonwoods gone yellow, the air with that cold, bright edge that means the world is beautiful and serious. When I came in from a 3-day ride with 3 of my men, a circuit of the country to the east where there had been reports of trouble at a crossing, and when I came into camp, Clara was at the fire. She was talking to Stan's watching and 2 of the other women, and she did not hear me ride in right away, and so I had a moment to watch her before she knew I was there. She was laughing at something. I did not know what. I had missed the beginning of whatever the story was, but she was laughing, and the women were laughing, and she was sitting in the circle of them with a comfort that was entirely unself-conscious, entirely genuine, the way you sit with people who are your people. Her Lakota was better, much better. She had Stan's watching's relentless pedagogy behind her, and it showed. She was using constructions I had not heard from her in the spring, idioms that take a long time to settle into a person's mouth correctly. And then she looked up, some change in the sound of the camp, some particular note in it that women in camps learn to read, and she saw me. I want to try to describe what crossed her face in that moment. Not for sentiment, not to make it into more than it was, but because it is the truest thing I know about that time in my life and about what I had been given. It was not surprise. She had known I was expected back around now. It was not relief, not exactly. It was something simpler and harder to name. The look of a person who sees the person they have chosen to be near and is glad. Just that. The gladness was plain, and it was quiet, and it was entirely, specifically for me. She stood up. She crossed the camp in that direct way she moved, and she came to the mare's head, and she reached up and she put her hand on my leg, not to help me down. I did not need helping down, just to put her hand there, the way you touch something real to make sure it is. 3 days, she said. 3 days, I said. I made coffee this morning, she said. There might be some left. I dismounted. I handed the mare off to Red Hale, who took her with an expression of such studied neutrality that I wanted to hit him. I walked back to the fire with Clara beside me, and the camp was doing what camps do in the late afternoon, the particular busy ease of the end of a day's work, smoke and horses and children and the smell of food. And I sat down at my fire, and she poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to me, and I drank it, and it was good. That is what I want to tell you. Not the big turns, not the hard moments, those happen too, and they are their own stories. I want to tell you about the coffee, about sitting at the fire I'd been cold away from for 3 days and having a woman who knew me, who had chosen to know me, pour coffee into a cup and hand it to me like it was the simplest thing in the world. Because it was, that's the whole of it. A man rides a long way. He does what needs doing in the cold and the dark, and he does not make a speech about it, and he does not ask to be noticed. He does it because it is what a man in his position does. And sometimes, if he is lucky, luckier than he knew to ask for, he comes home, and there is a fire and a woman who sees him plainly, who chose him specifically, who pours his coffee and puts her hand on his leg and says 3 days like it meant something that he was gone. It did, I know it did. I know because she told me once that February night by the fire, and she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. She had chosen when she didn't have to. She had stayed through the hard winter and come out the other side more herself, not less. She had looked at the scar on my face and the weight I carried and the life I led, and she had said, "This is what I want. I see what this is, and this is what I want." A man can go a long time without that. A man can make a kind of peace with going without it, build a life around the absence, make the absence into a shape he can carry. I had done that. For 4 years after morning salt I had done that, and I had told myself it was enough. Some mornings it was. But not all mornings. Not mornings like that late September one, when I came back from 3 days east and saw her laugh across the camp, and she looked up, and her face did what her face did, and I understood again, for the 100th time. that I was a man who had been given something he had not asked for and did not deserve in any accounting that makes sense to me, and that the only right response to that is to receive it without looking away and to be, every day, exactly what she saw when she chose. That is what I tried to do. The fire is low now, the coffee is gone. I just wanted to tell you how it was.